People Scientist, the podcast dedicated to helping us optimize our health with the latest scientific findings on nutrition, health, and medicine. I, your host, Dr. Stephanie Caligiuri, will be here with you every single week, bringing us information to ignite our thinking to help us be one step closer to the healthiest we can be. Hello everyone, and welcome to the very first episode of The People Scientist. For this podcast episode and all the episodes thereafter, I have one goal, and that is for every single one of my listeners, regardless of your educational background, to come from this podcast learning something new and feeling empowered because of it. So for our very first episode, I'm starting off with a big one, and that is a topic that I find absolutely fascinating, and that is food addiction. Now, food addiction can also be referred to as compulsive eating. Gosh, there's that train sound again in the background. I am so sorry. I try my best to avoid the sounds of New York City in the background of these podcasts, but I just can't seem to avoid it. So I'm sorry. I hope those sounds are not too distracting to all of you. So anyway, food addiction is also referred to as compulsive eating, overeating, sugar addiction, salt addiction, fatty food addiction. And specifically, I'm interested in the role our brain plays in these eating behaviors. Now, our brain is programmed with one goal in mind, and that is for us to survive. But sometimes what our brain thinks we need to survive is not actually what is best for us in the long run. For example, sugar. Therefore, we need to essentially outsmart our brain. And I'm going to tell you how to do that with my own list of brain hacks. Now, I've read so many scientific papers in preparation for this episode, probably about 100 or more, and I've come up with a list of 15 brain hacks that have sound scientific evidence in order for us to outsmart our own brain and take control of our eating behaviors. So if you're ready, let's jump right into it. First, in order for us to understand the brain hacks that I'm going to give you and how and why they can work, we need to briefly cover the topic of our brain and addiction, because I feel like there's power in understanding our own physiology. And I'm also going to talk about addiction because there are a lot of similarities between drug addiction and compulsive eating or food addiction. And I think making the connection can really lend to some powerful understanding. So drugs like cocaine, meth, heroin, nicotine, alcohol, and more act on the brain by hijacking and messing up our brain's reward system. But that's not what is supposed to happen. Our brain reward system is normally there to tell us something is good, that we need this for survival. So in order for our brain to reinforce this survival behavior, our brain tells us that this is good and gives us a feel-good, pleasurable response. As a result, the reward system is the most powerful system for learning, and specifically learning how to survive. The brain reward system is also a very powerful pathway for enhancing our memory. For example, hundreds of years ago, and of course before that, when the human race would have to hunt and forage for food, for example, let's say we came across a field of berries, and we ate all the berries in the field. This would activate our brain reward system. Our brain would be telling us this is a good thing because we need food to survive. Our memory of the field and the path that we took to get to the field would be even further enhanced by our brain's reward system. So the next time we come to this field, subconsciously, we will remember the field had food for survival. Our brain's reward system is very good at reinforcing our memory and motivation for these survival actions. That is, for example, why learning or studying can be further enhanced with a reward of some sort. More specifically, the brain reward system is called the Mesolimbic dopamine pathway, and that includes brain regions such as the ventral tegmentum and the striatum, sometimes also called the caudate putamen. These brain regions will release the neurotransmitter dopamine to elicit a pleasurable feeling. Now, in regard to drugs like cocaine, methamphetamine, nicotine, alcohol, they trick the brain by not being necessary for survival, but still eliciting a rewarding response in these brain regions. That's why we say drugs hijack this brain system. Now, individuals that are addicted to drugs will unfortunately have significant changes to the mesolimbic dopamine pathway that will very strongly motivate them to obtain the drug over all other actions that are needed for survival. Now, in another podcast episode, I would really like to delve more into the details of drug addiction with a particular focus on marijuana. But for today's episode, we're just going to focus on the concept of compulsive eating and food addiction. Now, we know that food very strongly activates the mesolimbic dopamine pathway, or the brain reward system. But why? Well, we know food, and particularly sugar. Sugar is the most powerful compound we can consume that will cause fat storage, which our brain thinks is a good thing. Sucrose is broken down to glucose and fructose, which tells our body to release insulin. Now, insulin is a hormone that tells our body to store fat. Glucose can also be converted into fat as well. Now, a long time ago, when the human race used to have to forage and hunt for food, storing fat was essential for survival during times of fasting and famine. So simply put, sugar equals fat storage, which equals survival. And remember, our brain reward pathway is primarily there to mediate our actions for survival. So that is why sugar and food activate this brain reward pathway so powerfully. Because sugary, salty, fatty foods are high in calories, they elicit such a pleasurable response in the brain. And these foods, therefore, have the potential for addictive tendencies. Now, some scientists will argue that food addiction is not a quote-unquote real addiction. However, there is surmounting evidence that there are many similarities between food addiction and addiction to drugs of abuse, such as cocaine. Now, clinically, physicians use a set of criteria to diagnose or identify drug addiction. This criteria is called the DSM-5 criteria. It's called DSM-5 because it's the 5th edition of this criteria. I and many other scientists would agree that people who state they have a sugary or savory food addiction could identify with a lot of these criteria. So as I list these criteria quickly, think about if you have ever experienced these feelings toward sugary, salty, or fatty foods. So number 1, taking the drug in larger amounts or for longer than you wanted to. Number 2, want to decrease your intake but can't seem to. Number 3, spending a lot of time obtaining, using, or recovering from using the drug. Number 4, craving the drug. Number 5, not being able to keep up with home, work, or school obligations because of drug use. Number 6, continuing to use the drug even though it may cause issues with your relationships. Number 7, giving up social, occupational, or recreational activities because of drug use. Number 8, using the drug continually even if it puts you in danger. Number 9, continuing to use the drug despite the negative physical, health, or psychological effects. Number 10, needing more of the drug to achieve the same high, or essentially gaining drug tolerance. Number 11, development of withdrawal that can be relieved by taking more of the drug. Now, I feel like for those of us that battle with overeating, we can claim that many of these statements hold true. Wouldn't you agree? Now that we know how sugary, salty, fatty foods can elicit addictive-like behavior, what do we know about these foods and how they actually affect our brain? Well, Paul Kenny, back in 2013, published a really interesting paper in the journal Nature Neuroscience. And they had shown that a high-fat, high-salt, high-sugar diet can actually cause the brain reward system to be less responsive. And that's a bad thing. Now, he performed a study in rats and divided the rats into 2 groups. Now, the control group ate the standard healthy chow, and the other group was provided the chow plus leftovers from their cafeteria. That included cake, candy, bacon, pizza, hamburgers, you name it. As expected, the rats eating the cafeteria diet quickly put on a lot of weight and became very obese. But what was most interesting about these obese rats is that they actually mimicked the behavior similar to that of rats addicted to cocaine or other drugs. Now, the obese and control rats were taught to self-administer sugar. So the rats would push a lever a certain number of times, and once they did that, they would receive a sugar pellet as a reward. Now, once the rats learned to do this, the investigators quickly added to the reward a very mild foot shock. It did not harm the rats, but would be aversive to them. Interestingly, the control group stopped pushing the lever immediately. However, the obese rats continued to push the lever to try to obtain the sucrose reward, despite the negative consequence. Now, this is a hallmark feature of drug addiction, that people will continue to try to obtain and take the drug despite negative consequences. Now, for example, this can be seen with compulsive eating when people will continue to eat the unhealthy food knowing that it's bad for their health. The investigators of this study also reported that particular dopamine receptors, and for my scientists out there, the dopamine 2 receptors in the reward center of the brain were decreased, resulting in a reward deficit. Again, this is a hallmark feature of drug addiction. When a drug no longer gives the same high as it used to, people will gain tolerance, essentially, and will take even more drug attempting to achieve the same high or the same pleasurable response. And that's really dangerous because that is when people may move from recreational drug use to compulsive drug use and addiction. Now, this is further supported by another study that was published by Stice and colleagues in 2010, and they had looked at a clinical population. They published a study investigating the response of the brain reward system to a milkshake, and they compared this response in women that recently gained weight versus those that had a stable weight. The investigators noted that the women who recently gained weight had a lower brain reward response to the milkshake, just like in the obese rat study, and individuals that tended to have that lower brain reward response were also at a higher risk for overeating. So recent weight gain and overeating seems to make things less pleasurable to us. And this potentially can lead to depressive-like symptoms or consuming even more food or drugs to try to get the same pleasurable response or the same dopamine release. Now, one of the most important phases in drug addiction, for which a lot of research has gone into in order to try to find a cure for addiction, is the phase called relapse, or otherwise called cue-induced reinstatement. Now, cue-induced reinstatement essentially means that a particular place when and where you normally consumed the drug will trigger you to crave more. So when you eat sugar, for example, the memory of the environment where you are eating is very powerfully stored in your memory. And that environment becomes a cue to look for sugar. Just as in the example I gave you of the field with the berries. Environmental context, as a result, is very important in trying to fight against drug addiction. Meaning the space you are in when you take the drug or eat the sugar becomes a trigger to make you crave the drug or sugar again. Your brain will motivate your actions to try and find that reward. That is why when trying to fight an addiction, removing yourself from the cue or the context is one of the most important and first steps. And that is my very first brain hack for all of you. So if, for example, let's say you normally eat your dessert or sugary or salty food in your living room in the evening in front of your TV. Then for the first while, you should really avoid that space in the evening, plain and simple. If you do not avoid that space in the evening, you are fighting against your own neurobiology. We know a brain region called the lateral habenula is activated when a reward is expected but not received. For example, when you enter the living room in the evening by the TV, where you normally eat your sugary foods, but you really try your best to fight your cravings and not have any sugar, your lateral habenula is being activated. The cue and the context is there, but the reward is not. The lateral habenula is associated with aversive, negative, and stressful feelings. This can potentially result in withdrawal-like symptoms. As a result, we need to try our best to prevent our lateral habenula from being activated. And that is why I suggest to avoid that cue or environment for a while. Over time, you can start to associate other activities in that space, such as reading, exercising, doing puzzles, chatting with your friends on the phone, and more, in order to change what that space means to you. For some people, that may take just a few days, but for others, that may take a few months. But until you've changed what that space means to you, you should avoid it, as it is such a powerful cue to induce your craving. Now, some people may say, Stephanie, I can't avoid my living room. That's where I hang out with my family. Or I have a very small apartment with only one bedroom and living room. So do I. But I'll respond to that saying, do you want to make your health a priority? Do you want to gain control of your cravings for unhealthy eating? If you answered no, then I'm sorry, but I can't help you. But if you answered yes, and you're serious about change, then you're going to have to go through some uncomfortable situations for a little while. It's the only way for all of us to grow. So you're going to have to remove yourself from that space temporarily. But if, for example, you just can't remove yourself from that space, there's another way to approach it that's not as effective, but somewhat of a compromise. So let's say, for example, your trigger space is your car. There's no way around it. You have to drive your car. And your car is your trigger space because let's say at the end of the day after work, you always go and you get fast food. Even thinking about going to your car at the end of the day can trigger your craving. So anticipate this and try to distract yourself with something else that releases dopamine in the brain reward pathway. And I'm going to dive into how to do that in just a minute. But secondly, try to change the appearance of the inside of your car. For example, get a new steering wheel cover, get a brightly colored seat cover, play your favorite songs in the car, or listen to an audio comedy show. It kind of sounds silly, but I tell you, the memory of that environment as it was before, when you used to eat your sugary, salty foods, is what is the trigger for relapse in craving. If you change what that environment looks like, or if you change what that environment means to you, then the brain regions won't be activated, causing you to have such a strong craving. We've known this for decades. So if you simply can't remove yourself from the environment, which is the more effective choice, your next best choice is to try to change the appearance of the environment and change what that environment means to you. My second brain hack is all about dopamine. We know that sugary, salty, fatty foods will cause our brain to release dopamine in the mesolimbic dopamine pathway, and that gives us a pleasurable response. So if we start to avoid these high-calorie foods, our brain is going to say, hey, where's that dopamine release I'm used to getting, around 6 p.m. every evening? And you could therefore potentially have withdrawal-like symptoms, which is often why people relapse and go back to their old eating habits. So to really fight against these food cravings, we need to incorporate other activities that are known to enhance dopamine in the brain reward pathway. And this is going to be my biggest brain hack. So after that first brain hack I gave you, here are 14 ways now to enhance dopamine levels so that you are not missing the dopamine release that these high-calorie foods would normally give you. So for the following ideas I'm going to give you, I would recommend incorporating some of these activities during the same time of day when you would normally crave and eat your unhealthy food items. Now, my first suggestion is exercise. Now, exercise is a common suggestion for people to feel better about themselves, and you're probably not surprised. You're like, okay, Stephanie, we know exercise is good for us, but hold on. I will tell you something new about exercise that you probably haven't heard before. And it is because of the following reason why I will say exercise needs to be the first and most important thing you add to your lifestyle if you're trying to overcome compulsive eating. Foley in 2008 illustrated that the effects of exercise on the brain reward pathway really occur after a period of time of daily exercise. They stated at least after about 6 weeks of regular exercise, they saw profound improvements in the brain reward pathway. And that is regular exercise starts to produce more dopamine receptors in the mesolimbic dopamine pathway. Now, this is so essential. If you remember earlier when I said that both Kenny and Stice published that obesity and overeating is hallmarked with lower dopamine receptors and a reduced reward signal, meaning that over time, people are going to eat more and obesity makes food less rewarding, gaining tolerance. So they're going to eat more and have that tolerance. But exercise can really reverse this negative consequence of obesity in the brain reward pathway. So you could conclude in theory then that exercise makes things more rewarding and more pleasurable again. So there are no ifs or buts around it. Exercise has a lot of evidence for improving this brain reward pathway. Now, the second suggestion I'm going to make is positive social interaction, aka hanging out with good people. We have known for a very long time that the opposite of social interaction, social isolation, very powerfully enhances drug intake and drug addiction. Social isolation can lead to boredom, anxiety, depression, stress, and reduced activation of the brain reward pathway, which, as I mentioned earlier, is one of the hallmark features of moving from recreational drug use to drug addiction. Now, social isolation does the same thing. I feel like in today's age, with access to social media and TV streams, it's so easy for us to stay inside and be isolated because it's good for us to be home and it feels pleasurable to just stay at home and watch our favorite TV shows. But in truth, in the long run, this doesn't do good things for us. So to counteract the negative effects of social isolation, social interaction really is the antidote. So get outside your comfort zone and try to spend more time with people, and good people that lift you up and inspire you. If you don't have people like this already in your life, there are ways to find them. When I first moved to New York City, I left all my friends and family back home. I had to make new friends. And I personally found people like this that were inspiring and positive at a women empowerment dance studio in the city. Some of my new friends go to networking events where the goal is to meet new inspiring people. You can even volunteer for a cause that you feel strongly about, such as an animal shelter, and be around like-minded people. These are examples of events or places that can help you find positive people in your life. My third suggestion is caffeine. Caffeine is known to enhance dopamine levels and another neurotransmitter, glutamate, in the brain reward system. Now, this was reported back in 2002 by Solinas and colleagues. We know caffeine is a stimulant, and it's thought that part of the reason why drug stimulants, such as methamphetamine and cocaine, can cause such a profound increase in dopamine in the brain reward pathway is because of its stimulatory effects. Now, caffeine, we know, is also a stimulant that seems to act on the same brain regions, but obviously to a lesser degree. Now, the FDA has stated that up to 400 milligrams of caffeine per day is safe for most people, but some may be a little bit more sensitive and should have less. One of the most common side effects of caffeine is feeling of anxiousness and heart palpitations. So if you're feeling that, please cut back on the caffeine. Now, 400 milligrams can be found in about 4 cups of coffee. A cup being 8 ounces. So don't think that a venti at Starbucks equals 1 cup, because it's much more than that. Now, for pregnant women, they should aim for 200 milligrams or less per day. My fourth suggestion is to get outside in the sunlight. Have you all heard of seasonal affective disorder? When during the winter time, people may feel more depressed. Well, people with seasonal affective disorder also tend to have insomnia, overeating, and increased sugar intake. I wonder why they're eating more sugar. You've probably guessed it. It's because their dopamine levels are low, and they're searching for other ways to increase their dopamine, so they eat sugar. Rosenthal back in 1984, and many investigators since, have reported that when individuals with seasonal affective disorder expose themselves to white full-spectrum light therapy at 2500 lux, that's a measure of luminance for light, when they expose themselves to this light for several hours a day, their dopamine levels actually rise, and their feelings of depression can subside. So getting outside in the sunlight more or getting light therapy may help increase dopamine levels. My fifth suggestion is heat therapy. Masuda and colleagues back in 2005 reported that thermal therapy or sauna use for 15 minutes a day significantly improved symptoms of depression in those with mild depression and dopamine deficits. They stated that even a warm bath at 42 degrees Celsius for 10 minutes may have similar benefits. For example, even if you want to try out hot yoga, which I personally love, you can tackle 2, maybe 3 of the things I listed already. So hot yoga, for example, can take off heat therapy, exercise, and even social interaction. Now, Masuda also concluded that heat therapy may reduce feelings of depression by acting on the autonomic nervous system, reducing levels of neurotransmitters such as norepinephrine. Heat therapy can also induce sedation, relaxation, and can increase the release of beta endorphins. Number 6, in contrast to heat therapy, cold therapy, as published by Shevchuk in 2008, may also be able to help with depressive-like symptoms by enhancing neurotransmitter release in the brain. This report was just a pilot study with a very small number of people, but nevertheless, it was a very interesting finding. Their protocol included a cold shower with 20 degrees Celsius water for just 2 to 3 minutes. Then they followed this up by 5 minutes of slowly, gradually increasing the temperature to comfortability. The theory is the cold water is a physiological stress that increases the release of beta endorphins into our system. Now, some people therefore may be wondering about whole body cryotherapy, which is quite trendy right now. And I did some research on whole body cryotherapy, but there really isn't a whole lot of information out there. There was one study, though, that was published by Ramaswezka in 2003. And they reported again in a small pilot study that whole body cryotherapy did appear to reduce measures of depression in those with mild depression. But again, keep in mind that these studies contain only a small number of people. And I also would say that for people that have heart conditions, should be very cautious about cold therapy, and in my opinion, should avoid it. Number 7, get a massage. Field and colleagues in 2009 reported that massages enhance dopamine release by on average 31% in people. Number 8, listen to your favorite feel-good music. There's something about music and the predictability of beats and rhythms that is very pleasing to the brain. Salampour in 2011 published that the anticipation of music elicited a dopamine release in one part of the brain reward pathway, and then actually listening to the peak of your desired song elicited a stronger dopamine release in a different part of the brain reward pathway. My 9th suggestion is laughing. For example, watching some comedy or listening to a funny podcast. Now, I couldn't come across any strong data to show that watching comedy elicits a dopamine response, but come on, who doesn't love to laugh? Number 10, being in unison with other people. For example, playing in a band, singing in a choir, or dancing as part of a group. We know these things elicit a very strong dopamine release and a feel-good response. Number 11, try to discover new things. We know that novelty or newness is associated with reward and pleasure. This has been replicated in both clinical and animal studies countless times. Because if you recall, the purpose of the brain reward pathway is for us to learn and reinforce ways to survive. So whenever we come across something new that's pleasurable, our reward system is activated even more strongly in order to store that memory. Now, everyone has experienced this. For example, a new love interest always seems more exhilarating in the beginning, or a new video game is more exciting than an old one, or a new song sounds even better in the beginning and becomes less exciting after listening to it for a long time. So to use novelty to our advantage, you can search for something new in your day-to-day life. For example, try and find a new cafe every week, or make a new friend. Experience a new fun dance class, find a new book, a new game, or even a new walking path. These are examples of new experiences that can enhance brain dopamine even more. My 12th suggestion is pet therapy. We know that having a pet or being around a dog or cat, for example, elicits an elevation in mood. And why do you think hospitals have volunteer pets going around, or why there are service dogs for people with severe mood disorders? So, for example, you could get a pet, be a dog walker, be a foster pet parent, or help take care of a friend's dog, for example. Number 13, develop a hobby that allows you to complete projects quickly. Have you ever heard of the saying, success breeds more success? Accomplishing a task often gives people a sense of satisfaction and pleasure. You can achieve small successes from a multitude of ways, and I really encourage you to make this a staple in your regular life. For example, some people can achieve small successes from doing puzzles, playing a video game and beating a level, competing against someone in a card game, or even learning a new language. Essentially, setting goals for yourself and accomplishing them is very good at gaining confidence and pleasure in your life. And number 14, the final suggestion, is not so much a way to increase dopamine, but rather something we should all avoid. Now, some people may attempt to control their sugar cravings by consuming non-caloric sweeteners, like diet beverages, for example. But I would suggest against this, as Chowdhury and colleagues have published numerous papers that the calorie-free sweetener aspartame, that goes by the brand name NutraSweet or Equal, actually reduces the synthesis of dopamine in our brain. This potentially can lead us to feeling even worse. While avoiding sugar, we already are experiencing lower than normal dopamine levels. Filetto and colleagues published in 2016 that another calorie-free sweetener, saccharin, that goes by the brand name Sweet and Low, may actually cause weight gain in rodents. And it did not cause the rodents to eat more than usual, but they still put on more body fat and body weight. So my suggestion is try to add these healthy suggestions, these healthy lifestyle suggestions, instead of eating these calorie-free sweeteners. So there you have it. In summary, the brain reward pathway is our brain's way of telling us, this is good, you need this to survive. But really, we're smarter than our brain and know that sugar is not actually good for us in the long run. That is why we are going to hack our own brain into getting out of a sugar or food addiction. Honestly, I feel that these brain hacks that I listed are not only applicable to people that have compulsive eating and food addiction, but it can also be appropriate for people that perhaps suffer from mild depression or drug dependence, such as to cigarette smoking. So now that I've given you some tips and tricks on how to outsmart our own brain, it's really up to us to make those healthy lifestyle changes. Remember, we only have one body, and it is up to us to take the best care of it as possible so that we can lead the healthy, fun life that we want to live. So until our next episode, I hope you all have a super healthy week, and make sure to tune in next time on The People Scientist. I am a scientist simply sharing scientific evidence. Some of the clinical interventions I discuss are not appropriate for everyone. Before making any changes to your diet or lifestyle, Please do consult the advice of your physician or dietitian. My opinions expressed here do not necessarily reflect those of Mount Sinai Hospital and its affiliates.